Hi, you guys. This is Kathleen from A Great Good Place for Books and Samantha from A Great Good Place for Books. Say hi, Sam.
Hi, everybody.
And I am so excited. We are hosting one of our great customers and a good friend of GGP. We are big fans of Patricia Bracewell, and we are so excited that the conclusion to her wonderful trilogy, The Steel Beneath the Silk, is finally out. And I need to say that Patricia has been incredibly supportive of GGP over the years. I can't tell you how many times she was a guest bookseller during bookstore day.
Oh,
And I remember one Christmas she came and wrapped presents. So, I mean, we definitely are a big fan of Pat's. And I'd like to welcome all of you here tonight. And we're going to have Pat explain kind of the evolution of the trilogy. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Pat. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here. I just am so thrilled. Thank you for having me. Well, Kathleen had asked me, as we were talking earlier, to say a little something about the first two books in the trilogy. So you can see them behind me. The first one is Shadow on the Crown. And in that book, Emma is a very young woman. She's about 15. And she is essentially part of an alliance between her brother and King Æthelred. And she is sent from Normandy to England to marry the king, who's much older than she is. So in that book, she doesn't have a lot of power. She's a stranger in a strange land, essentially. And she is kind of learning what's going on. She's finding out that there are enemies in England that are not friends to her or friends to the king, for that matter. So she's sort of getting her feet wet. And of course, the important thing is that she needs to have a son, even though the king already has 6 sons. So she's got a lot of stuff to work through in that first book. In the second book, Emma starts to make alliances with various people. She and the king are at odds still. That started in the first book. And she's starting to know who she needs to know and where she needs to give her favors in return for other favors. So she's figuring that all out. And it's in this third book that we really see Emma come into her own, come into a certain amount of power, as much power as a woman in the 11th century could have. And her power will get even greater towards the end of this book and into her future. So that's the story. And it's based a lot, very much, on the real life of Emma of Normandy.
So I have a question for you, Pat, before what drew you to this time period and this story?
It was Emma who drew me. This was back in the last century, in the 1990s. And I was looking for something to write about. I wanted to write a historical novel, something with a little grit to it that would still have a romantic element to it. And I bumped into a post. This was when we had bulletin boards, and this was before Facebook, it was before Zoom. and there was this mention of this Queen of England who was the daughter of the Duke of Normandy, the sister of another Duke of Normandy, the mother of 2 kings of England, and she was married to 2 kings of England, and she was the great aunt of William the Conqueror, and she was the reason he had a claim to the English throne. And I thought, who is this woman, and why have I never heard of her before? And so I started to do more research, and the rest is history. I couldn't get away from it. I thought, I'm going to write a book about her, so I wrote 3.
And did you always plan that it would be a trilogy?
I did. I knew that I wanted to get really close to Emma, and that I was going to have to educate people about the Anglo-Saxon period of English history, because even in the English history books, they don't know what happened before 1066. The Battle of Hastings, when William the Conqueror and the Normans took over, that's sort of like how they think of as the beginning of English history, but it goes way back before that. And so I needed to bring people into the story. And it's why I decided to use quotes from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is the contemporary account of events at that time, as little bits and pieces, as sort of a follow through throughout all three books. It sort of ties everything together.
Well, I would love to hear, as you talk, just more about the research process for you and kind of what you uncovered. Because I knew nothing, as you said, like knew nothing about this woman, and she's fascinating. And I've only read the first half of the third one. So now, of course, I want to go back and read the first two. But I think also really got me thinking about, what does it even mean when we say England? Like, we have such a strong sense of England as this independent, country that has actually gone out and been the sort of invading force in other countries, but it was so vulnerable at the time that you're writing about. It almost is shocking that there is an England, right? Like it felt like it was constantly being invaded and the threats on all sides, So I'm fascinated by the whole thing. So for your research, if you could talk a little bit about, if you had, like, what were some of your most exciting discoveries and things like that as you did this?
My research began, at UC Berkeley Library, doing research there, and through the Berkeley Library, getting books that I couldn't get anywhere else. But after I had written about half of the first book, I went online. I thought, I don't know enough about Anglo-Saxon history at this point to be able to feel comfortable that I know where I'm going to go with these books. So I went online and I found out that there was going to be a course, a summer course, a 2-week summer course at Cambridge University in England. And I went to my husband and I said, I don't know if I'm even going to ever sell this book. I don't know if I can even finish writing it, but I feel like I need to take this class. And it's going to cost money, and it means I'm going to have to go to England and spend some time there. And I'd really like to do it. And he said, well, why not? So we both went to England, and we drove through the Channel, and we went to Rouen, and we went to Fécamp, which is where I had decided I wanted to set the early scenes in that first book. And then we went back to England, and we went to Winchester and Canterbury and Exeter, all the places that were in that first book. And then he went home and back to work, and I went up to Cambridge and spent 2 weeks at this class that was called Kings, Queens, and Vikings, which was exactly the period of Anglo-Saxon English history that I needed to write this book. And so that was my first boots on the ground research. We went back to England numerous times. We went to Denmark, to Roskilde, to the Viking Ship Museum. So we've kind of run the gamut of a lot of research.
So great.
Yeah. But the most intriguing thing, you asked me what I found in my research. The most intriguing thing about Emma was something that I discovered right at the very beginning. And that is that she commissioned much later in her life, when she was twice a widow and she had a son on the English throne, she commissioned a book to be written about the things that she had witnessed or taken part in. And it's called the Encomium Emma Regina. It was written in Latin by a member of her household, a Flemish monk. And she must have been able to read Latin, because why would you have a book that you couldn't read? And we think that he got most of his information from Emma in this book. And what's really intriguing about it is that it starts basically where this third novel of mine starts, with Svein's final invasion of England. And then she goes forward from there, but she doesn't say anything about her first husband. He's not mentioned in that book at all. So there were a lot of reasons for that, which I discovered later, but it's kind of amazing that an 11th century woman is saying, I want a book written. And we're talking political spin here, because what she writes sometimes doesn't agree with what the other chroniclers were writing at the time. And so you have to weigh everything and decide who's telling the truth here. We just don't know.
Wow.
So that's the most important thing that I found about it.
Is your assumption is Emma was educated in
very
some way,
much,
which
yeah.
a lot of women.
Yeah, she was educated. She was, I think that her brother and her father, her father was the grandson of the founder of Normandy. So his grandfather was a Viking. He was Rollo the Viking. And I think what they wanted to do, they wanted to be accepted in European society. And that was one reason why Emma's brother, who arranged her marriage with Æthelred, wanted her to go to England and marry Ethelred, because England was the wealthiest kingdom in Christendom. And to have your sister married to this king, that was a big deal. And it meant you were a player in what was happening in the world, in Europe. And that's what they wanted. They wanted to be accepted.
It's so hard to imagine a 15-year-old girl. Like, I have a 15-year-old son, and I'm just going, I mean, were they just different? Like
girls are different. Girls are different. Don't you think? I mean, I was a high school English teacher, and girls are different than boys at 15.
At that age, yeah, no, I think you're right. But it's astounding, like, that she survived, let alone really like figured it out. And it's fascinating stuff.
Well, we don't know when she was born. So I was guessing at her age. We know when she died, which was March 6th of 1052. So she went to England in 1002, and she lived until 1052, 50 years, the next 50 years. There were 7 kings of England in that time. There was only one queen during most of it, except for like the last 5 years when her son married. There was only one queen, and it was Emma. And something that you were saying, Sam, England didn't really exist as we know it until Ethelred's father took the throne. So it had been, there were 7 kingdoms, and then there were 4 kingdoms, and then there were 2 kingdoms. And it was only Ethelred's father that combined everything and was able to hold on to that one kingdom that covered from the Channel all the way to Scotland. Mm-hmm. And his mother was the first queen of England, Ethelred's mother, the Edgar's queen. So Emma was the second queen of a united England. Yeah.
Have you always been someone, Pat, that was fascinated by finding these little nuggets of history?
Well, I've always been fascinated by English history. That started, I think, when I first read, I don't know, Black Beauty or something when I was a little kid. I've always been fascinated by English history. And that's why I was so surprised when I discovered Emma and realized I'd never heard of her. I thought that was so odd. So in terms of would I rather write or would I rather research? Probably I'd rather research. It's so much more fun. You get to go places. Well, not now, but we used to go.
You will again.
Yeah.
Do you want to read a little bit for us right now? Okay, I would be happy to. I prepared something.
Great.
I am going to read tonight from chapter 16. That's 159 pages into the book. So a lot has happened by this time. So I need to set the scene for you. Emma and her household are going into exile, and one of the company who is with her is Athelstan. And what you need to know about Athelstan, if you don't know already, is that he was the king's eldest son, and he was the man that Emma loved. In my story, we don't know that historically that's true, but in my story, he is the man that she has loved from the time she first arrived in England. So the queen and her companions are on their way. They're still in England. They're spending their last night in England at Emma's estate, one of her estates in East Anglia. And the queen is quite troubled. So she's pondering recent events and she's worried about the near future. And she makes her way by herself alone to her quarters. So now this is how we begin. Emma stood outside the hall for a time with her back pressed against the great door. The sky was clear, and a full moon had risen, so bright that shadows dappled the yard. She looked around her at this royal manor of hers that was but a small fragment of a once mighty kingdom. It was, she feared, the last glimpse of England that she would ever have. She had no wish to leave this land that she had grown to love. Home for her would always be England, where she had been queen, but where she was queen no longer. The enormity of what had occurred over the last few months and of the terrible uncertainty that lay ahead washed over her with a force and suddenness that all but drove her to her knees. Sven of Denmark was England's conqueror, and she had little hope that he would be gentle with its people. His followers would demand power, wealth, and lands, and they would take what they desired by force of arms. There will be no mercy, Athelstan had once warned her, and surely that was the truth. In London, she had tended men who had been wounded in battle and women who had been raped. She had seen the terrible consequences of power unleashed without mercy. Æthelred's thanes had abandoned him because he had failed to protect his people from the ravages of the Danes. Who would they turn to now for protection? She picked her way across the yard toward the familiar squat building that had long housed the Queen's bedchamber, and she forced herself to think at last about the task that lay ahead of her in Normandy. She had been charged with securing a place of refuge for the king, his family, and the retainers who would accompany him. It would not be easy, for she expected to find only recrimination and resentment awaiting her in Rouen. Her brother had gambled that her marriage to the wealthiest monarch in Christendom would bring him status and influence, but instead she would be asking him to support an exiled king. That burden weighed heavily upon her as she lifted the door latch and stepped into the dimly lit chamber. She remembered this room from her time here in the spring, and in all but one respect, it remained exactly the same as she had known it then. Pallet beds for royal attendants lined two of the walls, and in the far corner, shrouded by thick embroidered hangings, stood the oaken bed that had, over the course of many years, welcomed the wives of numerous kings. Immediately in front of her, a fire burned in the central hearth, casting a warm glow upon the single thing in the chamber that was different. Beside the hearth, Athelstan stood watching her, his eyes shining in the firelight. She did not move, rooted to the floor, not daring to take even a step closer to him, frightened as she was by the force of her own desire. "You should not be here," she whispered. He shook his head with a rueful smile. "I have ever been accused of doing what I should not," he replied. "A failing, I confess. I should not love my father's wife, and yet—" He shrugged, but the look in his eyes burned her. She wrapped her mantle closer about her, as if she could somehow shield herself from his searing gaze. Her need for him was so great. Where was she to find the courage to send him away? "What else have you been doing, Athelstan, that you should not?" she asked, trying to ease the tension that arced between them. "What is it that you and Ulfkittel have—" "I am not going to Normandy, Emma," he said. She felt as if he had slapped her, and her heart seemed to stop with the shock of it. For a moment, she could not speak, and Athelstan filled the silence. "I will sail at dawn for Bottom, not Bruges. I cannot leave England in Danish hands. Surely that cannot surprise you." No, she was not surprised, but she had convinced herself that he would do as his father had commanded. He would go into exile because it was what she wanted him to do, because she could not bear to leave him. And now it seemed he was to leave her. "You will take up the fight against the Danes," she sighed, and with a sinking heart she found the answers to the questions that had puzzled her. "Ulfkittel has already, it seems, broken his oath of allegiance to Sven, and he will fight beside you. That is why he is so insistent that his wife and son must leave England. In Normandy, they will be safe from Danish vengeance," he said. "And what of your safety, Athelstan?" she cried. If you are captured, she could not say it, nor did she need to. He knew the risks, but he also knew what he might gain. Once his father no longer stood in his way, Athelstan would make his own bid for the throne. She saw that now. And because this Atheling was a warrior proven in battle, and unlike his father, a leader to be trusted, he would inspire the men of England to throw off their new Danish overlord. The crown of England was Athelstan's by right, and if he survived the conflict that lay ahead, he would be a good and a just king. But first, he must survive. Does your father know what you intend? No. He would think me a traitor for challenging Sven under my own banner. You know how his mind works. Despite all that has happened, my father believes that the crown of England should still be his, and that somehow God will relent and give it back to him. He took a single step, erasing the distance between them and placing his hands on her shoulders. Emma, I have no choice. There will be nothing for me in Normandy, nothing there that I could possibly want except you. Yet you are the one thing on this earth that I can never have. She looked at him through eyes brimming with tears that she could not stem. On the morrow he would leave her, and the future without him yawned dark and cold and empty. She could not see past this parting, and she did not know how she was to let him go, for her heart told her that he was leaving her for the last time. I have always been yours, she whispered, even though my body belonged to another. And now, he asked, bending to tentatively, questioningly, graze his lips against hers. She could not move away. For too many years, she had denied herself, denied them both what body and soul had craved, and she could do it no longer. She responded hungrily to his gentle kiss and bound herself to him, mouth to mouth and breath to breath. It was as if she had set a flame to dry tinder. There you go.
Oh, that was wonderful. I love it when I hear authors read theirs, because nobody reads like, because you know exactly where the words and the cadence and everything.
Yeah.
I loved that.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have heard you read many times in the past, as you know.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to say one thing before we start. Richard Clark wants to congratulate you on your book.
Thank
so
you.
Before I forget, I wanted to make sure I let you know that he was thinking of you.
Do we
Sam, do you have any questions?
Oh, I do. I didn't know if we want, are there some questions in the chat? We could.
If people could put them in the Q&A of the Zoom, that would be great.
Let's see, what's there right now? Let's just check.
I don't think we have anything. We have Hannah Norton says, hi, Patricia. And how did you connect your English teaching with writing it?
I edit a lot. As an English teacher, I had to correct papers. Well, I corrected my papers a lot. And I taught English. I didn't teach history. So there wasn't that connection, although I did throw in as much history in my English classes as I possibly could when it fit. But yeah, I have this little critic who's an English teacher that sits on my shoulder when I write that doesn't let me get away with anything. So
Catherine Fisher wants to know, she says, Pat, tell me about the cover of the book. Who is the model? Oh,
that's an interesting story. There's the book cover. And everyone says, oh, she looks like me. She doesn't look like me. I met this lovely lady, and she is a member of the Society for Creative Anachronism. And if you don't know what that is a group of people. It's something like 33,000 people strong in the US and the UK, and they take on a persona from different periods of English history, and they have conferences. Well, I wouldn't call them conferences. They have meets. And so she was at a meet, and her name on this as a member of this organization is Arian Wen Furch Morgan. And she was the queen of her kingdom. It's divided in the US, it's divided into numerous kingdoms. She was the queen, and she was on her way to war. And we had this, she had posted this photo years ago on Facebook, and I looked at that photo, and of course it looked very different than this. We've touched it up a lot. We've moved her, and she had a lot of green behind her in the original photo, but she had this look on her face that was like, don't mess with me. And if you notice my first two books, you see Emma we see her back. And in this book, I wanted to see her face. This is really Emma as I imagine her, very sort of stern, because she had to be stern in this particular book. She's got it all together. And The Steel Beneath the Silk, I love that title. There's a scene in the book when Emma is being watched from a distance by two men, and they are commenting. And one of them says, she's in dark clothes, very dark gray. He says, she looks like a wraith in that gown. She's so thin and dark. And the person next to him says, she is no wraith. She's a Norman. There is steel beneath all that silk. And I thought, that's my title. That's the title of the book. So that's where that comes from. And it's not just Emma that has to be strong throughout this book. England, as Sam said, is constantly under attack by the Vikings and the Danes. And the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which tells us about the history of that time, mentions battles, it mentions men dying, it gives their names, it even mentions a tidal wave, which is in the book, but it doesn't say anything about the women. And they were there. They had to live through it. They lost sons and brothers and husbands and fathers. And that's what I was doing in writing this trilogy, was trying to tell their stories, which have been lost. And so it's not just Emma that is steel beneath the silk. It's even her rival Elgiva, and it's her stepdaughters, the sons of the king. And it's the women in her household, the noble women. It's the abbesses. And there's even one woman there who's a stand-in for just some faceless woman whose children were murdered before her eyes. So they are the women that are the steel beneath the silk. And it's not just them, it's all the women that have lived through terrible times like that and still are, whose stories don't get told. So that's where that comes from.
Wonderful.
Sam, do you want to take a couple questions from?
Sure. Okay, well, there is one, but I think maybe I want to save the new books for the end. I think maybe we'll hold on to that one. Can you tell me how your work, so this is John Fetto. Can you tell me how you work in backstory so seamlessly in your novels? Are there any tricks to how much to tell?
This novel in particularly was really hard to do. Once you get into the third novel, there's a lot of backstory that has to be brought in. And my first draft of this book, it really leaned a lot on the first two books, sort of kind of assumed that the reader would know everything. And actually, I had an editor, and she was the editor on my first two books, and she's no longer with that publisher. And she's on her own, and she went through it and pointed out to me all the places where I needed to bring in just a little bit, a sentence or two, to fill in for the new reader and to remind the old reader, that maybe somebody that's read the first two books, of what this was about. And what I really tried to do was, for example, if there's a scene that's in Emma's point of view in Shadow on the Crown, when I revisit it in a memory in the third book, I try to tell it through someone else's eyes. So that gives it a little different flavor. In fact, the whole prologue of this book is a scene that was towards the end of The Price of Blood. And I rewrote the scene from the omniscient point of view, whereas in that book, it was in Emma's point of view and Athelstan's. And I added stuff and I took it a little farther than the original scene went. And I worried the whole time with, oh gosh, it's just a little bit different. Is anyone going to notice? So that's the best I can explain it, John. You got to get help from somebody else to point, here's where you need backstory.
Yes. Okay, so we've got Terry Lucino asked if Emma ever suffered from health issues. I think she means like the flu, and if so, who took care of her? What was healthcare like back in 1012? I don't know.
I'm sure they had pestilence, and certainly there was pestilence in my second book. I talk about it. Emma would have had people that came with her historically from Normandy. She would have had her own household, and probably the king had his household and the queen had her household. And there were times when they mingled and traveled together. But she would have had people to take care of her at the time. And then, of course, in my story, her nurse from when she was a little girl comes with her. Mm-hmm. And she's in the first two books, but we lose her. Margot. We lose Margot in the second book. Oh. And Wymark comes with her. And Wymark is based on a real character who actually came with Emma from Normandy and had a son whose name was Robert Wymarkson. That's what he was called. No, I'm sorry. Robert Fitz Wymark. That's what they called him. Robert Fitz Wymark. And Robert was Edward the Confessor, Emma's son's best friend. So that's true. That's in the story, and that's based on fact.
Wow. Let's see. We have Joanne asks, hey, Pat, would you consider speaking to our local book group here in Monterey? So I don't know if there's a way to connect Joanne. Maybe we can get an email or something like that.
I'd be happy to do that.
Okay.
And let me just say, I'm part of Novel Network, which connects authors to book groups. And Novel Network, just Google it, and I'm on there, and you can schedule a meeting with me and your book group.
Great. Christine says, how many years have passed from the first book to the third book? And I'm not sure if she means in your life as a writer. In Emma's life. I'm assuming maybe let's take it from your life when you first wrote to now, maybe.
I started writing Shadow on the Crown in 2007, and now it's 2021. So someone else do the math because I'm an English major. And Emma's story started in 1002, and this book ends in 1017. So it's the 15 years of her marriage
in her life
to Æthelred, essentially. Yeah.
All right. Maybe Kathleen, I'll ask one more, and then you can. We got so many. We've got 26 in the Q&A, 25 in the Q&A. So I want to make sure we get a lot of these. So I'll do one more. Dick Jordan says, Pat, how does it feel to be finished? All caps. I can't believe that it's been 8 years since I filmed the book launch for Shadow on the Crown at Book Passage.
Well, it's a relief to be finished and a relief to get this book out because it's been a long haul between 2015 when The Price of Blood came out and now. It took me a long time to write this book. Yeah.
Great. Kathleen, do you want to field a couple?
Sure.
Yeah.
This is a question from Ann Smith. What was your reaction when you heard they found bones that could have been Emma's at Winchester Cathedral?
Well, and let me tell you, Anne Smith writes about Richard III, and her most recent book is This Son of York. So when they found Richard's bones, she went nuts, I can tell you. But I knew that Emma's bones were in Winchester Cathedral. What happened was in 2012, they started to examine them. The bones were all mixed up with other bones in these mortuary chests in the cathedral. And I had gone to Winchester, and these chests were way up high on top of an I don't know what you'd call it, a platform or something, way up. And I just sat there and looked up at that chest, knowing that it says Hic Jacet Emma Regina, so here lies Queen Emma, and just stared at it for the longest time. And now they've sorted through all the bones and divided them. They found more bones in these chests than they anticipated. Emma's bones are in the same chest with Knut's and their son Harthacnut's, and I think even Edmund Ironside, some of his bones are in there. So they've still got a lot of research to do, but there's an exhibit right now at Winchester Cathedral, and they did plaster casts of Emma's bones. And you can go there and actually see they're under glass. Look at them. And what happened was during when the Roundheads were coming in, Cromwell, that the Civil War, that's what I'm looking for, Civil War, they came in, the Roundheads came in and they pulled down those chests and threw them on the floor and grabbed some of the bones and threw them through the windows. Well, apparently Emma's skull got really damaged. And so they don't have they only have like half of her skull, which means that they can't do, the forensic people now can look at a skull and imagine what the face looked like. They can't do that with Emma's because of those darned Roundheads that threw those bones onto the floor. So
We've got a question from Anne Sigmund.
yes.
What language did Emma and Æthelred speak, and do you think she spoke English?
Well, I asked that of my professor when I took that class at Cambridge, and Emma's mother was Danish. So we think, and I've looked at a number of scholars, they think, and I think, that Emma probably learned Danish from her mother. She would have learned Norman French while she was growing up. She probably knew Latin, at least to read it, because it was the language of the law and it was the language of the church. So she would have known Latin. Old English, which is what Æthelred would have spoken, has a lot of similarities to Norse, the Danish, Old Danish. So I think it would have been pretty easy for her to pick that up. Pauline Stafford, who is the expert on Emma, she wrote Emma's biography, and I got most of my information from her biography about Emma. She said basically a girl would learn. Once she got to England, if she didn't know any English, Old English, when she got there, she would have been taught very quickly. And that was part of what she would have, what would have kept her from being really being able to have much agency when she was still very young. But once she got that down, I think she probably learned English pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. I think of her as a polyglot.
Here's a question from Amber Kennedy. And the question is, when England was a collection of 7, 4, or 2 kingdoms, how did they decide who was actually in charge? And was the seat of power always in London? Okay.
Well, each of those kingdoms had a king. So they were all, so there were 7 kings at one point. By the time of Edgar, that's Ethelred's father, there were 2 kingdoms, and Edgar and his brother, and forgive me, I can't remember if his name was Edwy or what, but they were both kings. So Edgar was king in the north, and his brother was king in the south. And when his brother died, then Edgar became king of the whole kingdom at that point. And there was a second part to that question.
Was the seat of power always in London?
No, it was in Winchester. In Anglo-Saxon times, Winchester was the royal city. And if you go there today, you still get that feeling that it was the Anglo-Saxon royal city going back to the time of Alfred the Great. and Alfred the Great was the king of Wessex. So Wessex was the southern part of England. That was the part that Edgar's brother ruled. That was one of the last kingdoms. If anyone knows Bernard Cornwell, the last kingdom was Wessex that hadn't been taken over by the Vikings. And so it's only in Ethelred's reign that we actually see London start to become the commercial powerhouse of England. And it's in Edward's reign that it really becomes the capital, the center.
Why don't I'll do one more question, Sam, and then you can do 3.
Sure.
I'm going to do Catherine's, which is, were there any primary sources or documents for Emma or your other characters that you enjoyed while you worked on the series?
Well, certainly I read Emma's encomium right away. That was the first thing that I read. I have it on my bookshelf, and I have it in Latin on one side and in English on the other. And so I enjoyed reading that. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, I have 2 versions of that. I have one in a big, beautiful book and another one that I've downloaded from the internet. There are also, William of Malmesbury wrote a history from that time, and John of Worcester was another one. So all of those I've read, and there are others that I've read about, but don't. Oh, William of Jumièges, he was writing in Normandy. So I was able to get a translation of his history of the time. So yeah, there are a lot of, but they come a little bit later, like William of Jumièges and Malmesbury and Worcester, they all come in the 12th century. So they're like writing 100 years later.
I have a question. Do you read Latin?
I took Latin when I was in high school, but medieval Latin, no, absolutely not. There's Google Translate, and that sometimes helps. But a lot of this, like the charters that were written in Latin, are online and they're translated, and you can read them. And that's how I've seen those. Same with Old English. I don't read Old English, but I've seen a copy of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle written in Old English at the British Library. And you can get it in translation so that you can see the Old English on one page and the English on the other, and the modern English on the other.
Wow. So Tricia Gorman first wants to compliment you on the Bayeux, am I pronouncing it right? Bayeux tapestry on the pillow behind you. What's the pronunciation of that?
So what was the last part?
Well, she's appreciating it, but how do you pronounce the Bayeux? So first she wants to say she loves that. So the question, and I've seen a couple versions of this, so this is a good question. How do you fill in the blanks as an author? We know so little about women in history, as you pointed out, but you can research the things we do know about the day and age, so you have to imagine a lot. I wonder how you know how far to go and where to rein in the imagination, where it's going beyond the times you're trying to depict. Where do you find the balance?
You know, that's such a hard question to answer. And I think every author, every historical novelist is going to answer it differently. Rule number 1, don't change history. So when I wrote Shadow on the Crown, I knew that I needed some kind of love interest, and it wasn't going to be between Emma and Æthelred. So I had to find something. I mean, you want your book to sell, right? If you if you want a book to sell, you have to have a little bit of romance going through it. And Emma and Athelstan would have been about the same age, and I was 15 once, and I know what happens when you're 15 and you get together with somebody else who's 15 who happens to be of the opposite sex. What could possibly happen? So that was, you know, uppermost in my mind when I was first thinking about it, but I would not have had her have a child by him. Okay, I wouldn't do that, because we know that her children were Æthelred's. So you kind of make a line, I guess, in the sand that you're not going to cross. Mm-hmm. And I often think of it, and I've said this before, back when I was talking about Shadow on the Crown. You've probably heard me say this, Kathleen. I think of history as like a tree, and history has all these branches, and they're bare. And the historical novelist comes in and starts to put leaves on the tree to fill in the blanks. And historians we couldn't do anything without the historians. We stand on their shoulders. God bless them. They're wonderful. They do all the grunt work. But I sometimes feel like they see these people as stick figures. He was here then, he was here then, he did this, he did that. And they don't ever try to get in their skin because that's not their job. Their job is to tell what truth we know. In 1016, there was a terrible battle at Assendon, and the Danes won and the English lost. That's what the historian says. The historical novelist says, what did that feel like, both for the winner and for the loser? Can I have somebody that was at that battle talk about what happened at that battle? And what can I pull from history that I can use in that description? So that's basically what you try to do, is you try to get inside the mind and the heart and the skin of your characters to figure out, what was that like? Why did they do what they did? It's why I gave Æthelred a ghost, because I couldn't come up with any other explanation for some of the stupid stuff he did as king. Why did you do that?
Yes. So a little while back, you just mentioned the characters. Jamie asked a little earlier, who was your favorite character to write? Did you?
Elgiva. Because I was constantly tormenting her. Poor Elgiva. she's like, a coin, and Emma's on one side, the bright side, and the dark side is Elgiva. They're very alike. And even in this book, I have Elgiva think that, we're alike in a lot of ways. But I just loved tormenting Elgiva. And she, maybe she's the most like me. I don't know.
That's great.
Bad girl.
Okay. Joanna Bigger says, congratulations, Pat. I got the book today. Do I understand that Æthelred is sending his family to Normandy just as Emma is about to return? Do they intersect, and does Emma reclaim any of her Norman Viking past?
Well, I'm not sure I understand the question. Of course, I was doing the reading, and Emma was going to Normandy. She was going into exile, and the king is going to go into exile later. He goes a couple months later. He waits. Mm-hmm. So they don't, he's in Normandy with her eventually. Mm-hmm. He follows. She prepares the way. So there's no crisscrossing. But Emma does go back to England, as far as I know. She goes back to England with her children. And is there until the end of the book.
So we've got just a comment from Jenny that says, love hearing about the history. Keep it coming.
Yeah.
And then Mikkel Strutton says, were the kingdoms of England before unification more like large tribes? And by the way, it's a great title.
Okay, so Anglo-Saxon England covers 600 years. So the farther back you go in history, the more tribal it becomes. So that you have a king and he's a gift giver, and that's basically the tribe. And people, and even in Æthelred's time, when the kingdom was totally united, the people in Northumbria were more connected, more loyal, more supportive of their own group, their own family, their own clan. Think of it as a clan. Than they were this king who was so many miles away in London or Winchester down in Wessex. They didn't care about him. Their strong loyalties were to each other, to that group, that closely knit group, which is why there's so much, well, I'm not going to go into it. You'll find out when you read the story, but that's part of the problem that was going on in England, that they did not think of themselves as a nation. Mm-hmm. They thought of themselves as clan groups.
Mm-hmm. I actually want to sneak in a question of my own. Am I remembering correctly that she actually owned some of her own estates outright? Like somehow she had worked out that deal. I thought that was fascinating. And was that part of a fact that you knew, and that piece? Because that seemed sort of unusual for a woman to maybe have that power, but maybe it wasn't. I don't know.
Well, there were certain properties that went to the queen. And I don't know how, and now this was true in Wessex, and then it became, as England became England, there were certain properties that were earmarked for the queen because she needed money, right? So here's these estates, and they have money from selling their food, from selling their the wool from their sheep, or whatever they make. There's an income that goes to whoever's in charge. And Emma had properties in Exeter, she had properties in Rutland, she had properties in East Anglia, and those were traditionally belonging to the queen. Now in Winchester, and if you've read the first part of the book, then this is probably what you're thinking. We have a charter from 1012 where Emma was actually given property in the town of Winchester. She was given what was called a tenement at that time, which means it was a town estate. And she could rent it out or she could live in it. And eventually she lived in it, but during the time when she was living in the palace, she didn't need to live in this estate that was within the city itself. And so she could rent it out and have the income for herself. Now, when her first son was born at Islip, she gave him a property as a gift from her, as a birthday gift to her son. So we know that she had certain properties that were hers for her lifetime and beyond. She was able to leave some of those properties in her will to give to whoever she wanted to.
Wow.
We have a question from Lois Temple.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm sorry, Sam.
No, you're fine. I think actually, I don't see Lois's, but yeah, you ask yours, and then I'm just noticing the time. I want to make sure we get a few of these. But what was Lois's, Catherine?
What advice do you have for aspiring medieval historical fiction authors who want to tell stories of real women and the complex aspects of their lives? So often publishers don't want long books from new authors and seem to prefer lighter romance genre historicals.
It's tough right now out there. I'll be honest, it's tough. Right now, the publishers are looking at World War I and World War II. When I first started writing, that wasn't even historical fiction. That was still, we remembered that. But everything changes, it's cyclical. Who knows? My first book didn't sell for 2 years. And then Game of Thrones came on TV. And all of a sudden, everybody wanted something that was dark medieval. And if George Martin ever finishes his final books, who knows? Medieval could be big again. But I think the important thing is to write what you want to write. Write for yourself. That's what I do. I write for myself. And then cross your fingers.
So we've got a state of Maggie Plagueman writes, not really a question. She says, "Hi Pat, I can't wait to read your book. Thank you for reviewing the first two because I haven't had the pleasure of meeting Emma. I also do not know this period of history well. So happy for your successes. We English teachers need to stick together. Love, Maggie."
Oh, that's lovely. She was my son's 7th grade teacher. And he's in his
Maggie's
30s now.
a big customer at GGP.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, so right here at the end, there are actually 3 that are all kind of on the same topic, which was an earlier one that I was saving anyway. So what is your next project? What do you think you'd like to tackle for your next book?
Well, when I turned this book in to the publisher and she read it and she, because I was, do you want to publish this book? She got back to me and said, I do want to publish this book very much. And please tell me it's not going to be the last book about Emma. So this is the end of the trilogy. That doesn't necessarily mean that I might not go forward because I've done a lot of research lately on the later part of Emma's life. And I have thoughts that are a little bit different than the accepted historical view of what happened. So I'm pondering that, but I don't know. I have an ancestor who was with the company that captured John Wilkes Booth after the assassination of Lincoln.
That would be cool.
And I'm thinking, gosh, that might be an interesting story to tell. I don't know. I haven't made a decision yet. Everything has been focused on finishing the trilogy and getting this book out and promoting it. And I'll be promoting it probably for the next few months before I can think about anything else. And hopefully we can start traveling again. And then who knows? The world is my oyster.
So we've got one final question from Leslie Allen. She wants to know, if they make a film based on your trilogy, who would you like to play Emma?
Oh,
I
gosh.
have my idea.
I don't.
I think Kate Blanchett.
I'll go with that. Kate Blanchett. I think she's a little long in the tooth for 15-year-old Emma.
She is, but maybe they could find well, she only has sons, so that wouldn't work.
That's a tough one. I'm not up on all the, the most recent young things that are out there these days. So I have no idea. Let's say Kate Blanchett. Why not?
She makes a good queen.
Yeah, exactly.
Wonderful.
So we just have two comments, and then it's not Mara Dale Link writes, it's not a question but a comment. I relate to Patricia's comments that the history began with 1066, but then I read a book about Harold and his wife, and that threw men into earlier English history. Thank you so much. I feel privileged to be a part of your webinar.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
And then Loretta Sansusi writes, congratulations, Pat.
Yay.
These are people from my past. I haven't seen Loretta in years.
I have to tell you, Loretta's from my past too. I've known Loretta for about 30 years.
Great.
And I'm sure you sold some of Dan's books there too.
I've sold Dan, and I was a big fan of Bob's too.
Yeah.
So Sam, thank you. And Pat, this was awesome.
Thank you so
That's
much.
all I can say is it was so much fun. And we will have more books tomorrow. And if not, we've got a bunch on order, so they're due in any day. And Pat will come in and sign them to anybody who wants it signed to them.
Absolutely.
And we will ship it to anybody who wants it shipped.
Yes.
So Pat, thank you so much. And thank you for letting us be a part of this. And Samantha, thank you so much for being a part of this with me. And Mike, even though nobody sees him, he's our guru over there.
Yeah, we couldn't do any of this without Mike. Yeah.
Thank you both. It's just been wonderful. And you too, Michael.
And I want to say that this is so great on a personal note, because I've known Pat since I got the store in 2005, and I believe we met right before I got the store. So it's been a long journey we've been on, and I'm so excited to see this trilogy finally complete. And I can't wait to see. I can't wait to see what you do next. So you guys, let's thank Pat.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you all.
And so we will have books, and Pat and I will connect tomorrow morning.
Yep.
At some point, and we will keep ordering books. And I wish we could get the first two books in print, but we haven't been able to. We've been trying, and let's make this one a bestseller. Darn it.
Yes.
So thank you so much. And I wanted to remind everybody that a week from tonight, we have Jill Santapalo with her new book, Everything After, in conversation with the wonderful Jandy Nelson, who won the Prince Award in 2012 for I'll Give You the Sun. But Pat, thank you so much.
This is Mike. Just one thing I wanted to mention about the first two books. They are available on Libro.fm, which is in audiobook. So
that's awesome. I didn't know that.
This one is not yet up there.
But
I assume it can be put up there.
We can put a post up, Pat. We can put a post up on our Facebook page with the links for those.
That's great.
Yeah.
Terrific.
They'd be great too. That'd be fun.
Yeah. And I'll talk to my publisher, make sure that it gets up on Libro, this new one.
Okay.
Thanks all. Good night.
You guys, thank you so much. And Pat, we'll connect in the morning.
Yes.
All right.
Congratulations.
Bye.